"You're the most useless man ever." Those words weren't just a careless insult. They were a knife, driven straight into the heart of a father who had sacrificed everything. Betrayal rarely comes from strangers. It comes from those we love most, those we'd give our last breath for. And when love is met with scorn, when sacrifice is repaid with humiliation, it leaves scars that last a lifetime. This story is about what happens when patience runs out, when dignity is finally reclaimed, and when silence turns into strength. Before we dive into today's story, I recommend you hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell, so you never miss a new story filled with drama, resilience, and unexpected twists. If you enjoy this video, type 1 in the comments. If not, type 0 to let me know how I can make better content for you. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and maybe grab your favorite drink, because this is a tale you won't want to miss. Let's get started. I have lived in Austin, Texas, long enough to see the skyline rise and the neighborhoods change, but my days have slowed into a rhythm that suits me. At 61, with nearly 3 decades of running emergency calls as a Travis County paramedic behind me, I now wake up to quieter mornings. Instead of sirens and radios, I listen to the drip of my coffee maker and the hum of the refrigerator. My duplex on South Lamar is modest, but it's mine, and it pays for itself with 2 steady tenants who don't cause me trouble. A few days a week, I still meet an old friend at our food truck, El Jefe, parked near Riverside. We sell barbecue plates to office workers and college kids, and though I don't need the money, I like the smoke, the rhythm, the conversations. My late wife, Elena, is everywhere in this little house. Her photo in the kitchen watches me while I measure out the coffee grounds. The frame has a nick on one corner from when we moved in, and I never bothered to fix it. I like it that way, a reminder that life leaves marks and still keeps going. Sometimes, when the light falls across her smile just right, I swear she is still offering me quiet encouragement. Even now, 8 years gone, she is the center of my compass. My son, Evan, is 33. He was a quiet boy, but somewhere along the way he found a voice that dreamed bigger than his pockets. He runs a co-working studio downtown, a place where musicians and designers rent space by the hour. He calls it innovative, I call it risky. The rent, the sound equipment, even the first months of payroll for his 2 assistants came from me. Madison, his wife, is sharp, quick with people, always talking about networking and elevated experiences. She runs small events when she can. Together they look the part of a modern Austin couple, stylish furniture, curated social media, and a Christmas tree tall enough to scrape the ceiling beams. Meanwhile, I fix my own leaky faucet and mend the torn screen door with duct tape. I eat leftovers or whatever brisket we couldn't sell from the truck, but I don't begrudge them. At least, that's what I tell myself. A father gives, sometimes until he forgets to count. The city feels alive this time of year. South Congress is strung with lights, every shop window glowing, every bar spilling out country songs or mariachi versions of carols. The smell of brisket mixes with tamales and roasted pecans from vendors along the sidewalks. I walk there sometimes just to remember what Elena loved most. People gathering without pretense, food you could hold in your hand, music spilling out of every corner. This Christmas I considered reviving one of her traditions, tamales wrapped in red cloth, set on the table beside a pot of beans. I thought maybe I'd invite Evan and Madison over after church, let the night soften into something familiar. The thought of filling this house with voices again made me smile, even if I knew it was a fragile hope. My mornings carry their own peace. I check the rental schedule for the duplex, make sure no maintenance requests slipped past me. I glance at the weather report to decide if the truck can run. I read the Austin American-Statesman at the table Elena once decorated with wildflowers and old coffee cans. Routine steadies me the way sirens once did. Yet underneath that calm, there's always the hum of uncertainty. Evan's business is unsteady. Madison is restless, always wanting to climb into circles where people sip wine and talk about investments I never heard of. I know how far I've stretched myself to help them. I know how quickly people forget the invisible scaffolding holding up their lives. Still, I hold on to the thought that family is worth the strain, Because if you let go of that, what else is there? On the porch in the evenings, I sit in a wooden chair worn smooth from years of use. From there, I watch traffic pulse along Lamar, hear the distant thump of music from bees, and breathe in the cedar-tinged air. I think about the calls I ran long ago. Accidents on I-35, house fires, heart attacks on porches just like mine. In those moments, family always mattered more than the chaos. That belief carried me then, and I try to let it carry me now. Christmas lights blink from houses up and down the street. Couples hang ornaments together, kids race scooters under the glow, neighbors call greetings across fences. I see them and feel both close to and far from it all. The world is festive, but inside me, there's only a soft anticipation, a hope that maybe this year, something different will happen. Maybe Evan will see me not as a safety net, but as the father who still wants to share a meal. I take a slow breath, sip the last of my coffee, and glance at Elena's picture through the window. Maybe this year, I whisper, though no one hears. The night answers with silence, and I sit back in my chair, waiting for the next chapter of whatever story is about to unfold. If you're still watching and felt that first sting of betrayal as deeply as I did, comment number 1 below so I know you're with me. Now, let's step into chapter 2, where the cracks in trust begin to show. The night before Christmas Eve, I drove down to Evan's studio, a squat brick building tucked between new high-rises and aging warehouses on the east side of downtown Austin. Colored lights draped across the windows flickered like an invitation, though I already knew the invitation wasn't meant for me. Inside, the air buzzed with the frantic energy of last-minute preparation. Madison moved briskly from table to table, adjusting centerpieces, checking lighting, directing 2 young interns with the sharp tone of someone who thought she was running a gala instead of a small networking event. This wasn't a family gathering. It was something Madison called the Christmas Eve Industry Mixer. She had pitched it as an evening where local entrepreneurs, musicians, and event organizers could mingle with journalists and potential investors. Grant and Pamela, her parents, were flying in, and she made it clear the studio needed to look perfect. To her, it wasn't about Christmas, it was about spectacle. I carried a small box with tamales I'd picked up from Tia Miguel in San Antonio. They were Elena's recipe, the kind that made Christmas smell like home. I stepped into the room and raised the box lightly. "Thought I'd bring these for tomorrow," I said. Madison's eyes flicked to the box, then back to the display table where she was arranging imported cheeses. "Guests here prefer vegan charcuterie," she replied flatly. "But thanks." The words landed soft as a slap. I looked at Evan, who stood nearby fiddling with his phone, pretending he hadn't heard. For a second, I considered pushing back, reminding them that food is more than trend, that tamales were how our family marked the season. But I bit my tongue. The mixer wasn't mine to defend. As I set the box carefully on a corner table, I bumped into a tray of delicate glassware. One stemless wine glass toppled and cracked against the polished floor. The sound cut through the hum of conversation like a bell. Before I could stoop to gather the pieces, Grant appeared beside me, tall and immaculately dressed, his tone dripping with polite disdain. "Careful there," he said. "We wouldn't want ordinary things breaking the vibe tonight." I felt heat creep up my neck, but I forced a thin smile. My mistake. Grant offered no smile in return, just a glance toward Madison that said more than words. "See? This is why he doesn't fit in." I gathered the shards into my handkerchief and set them aside, trying not to let my irritation show. On the wall, a glossy poster announced the evening's theme: dress code, elevated cocktail. The words mocked me. I imagined showing up in my worn boots and navy blue shirt, the one Elena once told me brought out the color of my eyes, and realized I would stand out like a misplaced note in a symphony. For a moment, doubt gnawed at me. Maybe I should stay home. Maybe they'd be happier if I disappeared altogether. But then I thought of Elena. She would never have bowed to someone else's idea of worth. She would have said, "Walk in proud, even if the room doesn't clap." So I resolved to wear that navy shirt tomorrow, not to impress them, but to remind myself I still had dignity. I headed for the door, the sounds of rehearsed holiday playlists and laughter fading behind me. Just as I reached the hallway, I heard Madison's voice, low but sharp enough to carry. "Your dad is always unnecessary, a little too much, useless." The word hit me harder than any glass breaking. Useless. 30 years of work, nights without sleep, bodies lifted from wrecks, lives saved on highways, and to my son's wife, I was nothing but a nuisance. I stopped for half a second, waiting for Evan to say something, anything, to correct her, but silence pressed heavier than her insult. The sound of his phone tapping was the only answer. I pushed open the door and stepped out into the cold Austin night. The pavement was slick from an earlier drizzle, and the neon from a taco truck across the street reflected in broken patches on the ground. Christmas lights twinkled above storefronts, but they looked distant, like stars I could never touch. I walked slowly to my truck, the tamales still warm under my arm. Each breath carried the sharp bite of cedar and exhaust. Around me, the city roared with holiday life, but inside I felt the first crack widen, the realization that this Christmas wasn't going to be the bridge I'd hoped for. Something fragile had snapped, though the final break was still to come. As I slid behind the wheel, I glanced once more at the studio. Laughter spilled from inside, bright and false, a world where I was already forgotten. I started the engine and let the rumble steady me. Tomorrow, I promised myself, I would still show up in that navy shirt. Not because they wanted me there, but because I wasn't ready to surrender the last of what made me family. If you're still here and can sense the storm building, drop a number 2 in the comments so I know you're feeling the tension too. Now, let's move into Chapter 3, where the first real blow lands. Christmas Eve arrived with a sky as clear as glass, the kind of winter evening where the cold doesn't bite but instead lingers in the bones. I pressed the navy blue shirt Elena had once told me made my eyes look younger, then tucked it neatly into my jeans. I polished my boots, brushed my hair, and for a moment in the mirror tried to believe I looked like a man ready for a family celebration. A box of tamales rested in my hands, their warmth seeping through the foil and red cloth. It was the last piece of tradition I had left to offer. The streets downtown glowed with colored lights strung across bars and taco joints. Couples hurried into restaurants, children darted between parents' legs, and carolers on one corner sang with brass instruments that echoed against the brick facades. When I parked a block from Evan's studio, I could already hear the pulse of music inside. The windows glimmered with movement, silhouettes of people I didn't know. I walked up slowly, heart thudding heavier than it should. 10 minutes early, just enough time to show willingness, not desperation. The door cracked open, and there stood Evan, his face caught between a smile and a grimace. He looked at me, then over his shoulder into the crowded room, then back at me again. "Not the right vibe, Dad," he muttered. His words were soft, but they carried more weight than he realized. Before I could answer, Madison appeared, her sequined dress catching the light like shards of glass. She swept in with a voice loud enough for nearby guests to hear. "This event is for people who can talk about art, founders, investment rounds, not brisket stories and old ambulance runs." I froze, the tamales growing heavier in my arms. My son shifted uncomfortably, eyes glued to the floor. Madison's smile never wavered. Then she said it, clear and sharp. "You're the most useless man ever." The words punched the air from my chest. For a second, I couldn't move. Memories of nights spent running emergencies, of mortgage payments covered, of equipment bought so Evan's dream could stand. All of it collapsed into silence at that one word, useless. I lifted the tamales slightly. My voice, when it came, was steady but low. "At least try them." They were Elena's recipe. Madison tilted her head, lips pressed thin. "We don't need that here." Her eyes slid past me as if I were already gone. Evan said nothing. That hurt more than Madison's cruelty. My son, my only boy, who had once held my hand crossing South Congress during Christmas parades, who had eaten tamales so hot they burned his tongue, but asked for seconds anyway. He stood silent, as though my presence were something to apologize for. I placed the box gently on the doorstep. My voice cracked only once as I said, "Merry Christmas." Then I turned and walked away. Behind me, the music swelled again, laughter rising like a curtain that had briefly dipped only to hide me from their stage. The night air cut colder than it had earlier. I pulled my jacket tight, walking slowly past rows of cars. Austin was alive with celebration. But each cheer, each burst of music, seemed to push me further into solitude. I crossed the street under the glow of holiday lights strung between lampposts, their colors blurring as my eyes watered. As I neared the corner, I heard a small band, 3 men with trumpets and a guitar, playing Silent Night. The notes floated soft and steady, filling the air with something like prayer. I stopped, letting the music wash over me. It carried a weight I needed, reminding me that silence can hold strength, that dignity sometimes grows only after humiliation. The tamales were gone, the invitation never given. But standing there, I realized the night wasn't only about exclusion. It was a marker, a threshold I had crossed. I could no longer pretend generosity alone would earn respect. I could no longer believe showing up quietly would guarantee a place at the table. Respect had to be demanded, even if it meant standing outside in the cold. I walked back to my truck, the engine grumbling to life. Ahead of me, the city pulsed with light and noise, but inside the cab was only stillness. My hands tightened on the wheel, and for the first time in years, I felt something different rise within me. Not despair, but resolve. If you're still watching and that turning point hit you hard, leave a number 3 in the comments to show you're following along. Now, let's head into Chapter 4, where attempts to fix things only make them worse. When I pulled into my driveway that Christmas Eve, the porch light flickered in the same tired rhythm it had for months. I killed the engine and sat for a moment in the dark cab, staring at my reflection in the windshield. The navy shirt I'd pressed so carefully this morning now felt like a costume for a play I'd never been allowed to perform in. Madison's voice still rang in my ears, but louder than her insult was the silence of my son. He could have spoken one word in my defense. He chose not to. Inside, the duplex was quiet, every creak of the floorboards amplified as I walked to the kitchen. I set the keys down and leaned against the counter, trying to let the warmth of the house soothe me. It didn't. The rejection at the door clung to my skin like smoke. I poured a glass of water, drained it in 2 gulps, then set the cup aside. If I stayed still, I would stew in bitterness. I needed to move, to act, to remind myself that I had a choice in all of this. I went to the bedroom and pulled open the bottom drawer of my old oak desk. Inside were folders stuffed with contracts, receipts, and copies of emails. Every document that had tethered me financially to Evan's dream. For years I had kept them hidden, thinking I would someday need to tally the sacrifices I'd made. Tonight, they felt less like records and more like shackles. I flipped through pages of bank statements, credit agreements, and invoices. My name appeared everywhere, written in ink that proved I was more than a bystander. One folder in particular held the paperwork for the revolving line of credit I had opened to cover Evan's shortfalls. I stared at the numbers, the interest, the balance I had carried like an invisible stone. Enough. I picked up the phone and called the bank. The hold music was tinny, but when a representative answered, I felt my voice steady. "I want to close this credit line," I said. She asked if I was sure, reminded me of flexibility and convenience. "Yes," I said. "Close it tonight." When she confirmed, I felt a strange release, like loosening a belt that had been cutting off my breath for years. I wasn't finished. I opened another folder, this one for the sound equipment I had financed when Evan insisted he needed the latest audio mixer. The warranty and responsibility were under my name. I drafted an email to the supplier, requesting that all obligations be transferred to Evan's account immediately. I typed slowly, deliberately, each keystroke an act of reclaiming control. When I hit send, I sat back and exhaled. My phone lay on the table. I picked it up, opened a new message, and typed, "Love you. From now on, I won't guarantee loans. Standing on your own is a gift too." I read it 3 times before pressing send. Short, honest, final. It wasn't angry, it was the truth. I put water on the stove and brewed a cup of tea, letting the steam curl upward into the dim kitchen. I wrapped my hands around the mug and listened to the quiet. For the first time in years, I wasn't running calculations in my head about what bill or emergency might drain my account next. I thought about the tamales still waiting in the fridge and decided I'd bring them to the church tomorrow, or maybe hand them out to the homeless men I often saw near Riverside. Food, at least, always found someone who appreciated it. Before heading to bed, I opened the small box where I kept Elena's wedding ring. I hadn't worn it since the funeral, but sometimes I held it when the world felt too sharp. Tonight, it glowed in the lamplight, warm against my palm. I closed my fingers around it and felt the weight of her memory steady me. She had known when to be gentle and when to draw lines. I whispered, "I'm learning, Elena," and set the ring back carefully. The house was still, but inside me something had shifted. I could not control Madison's contempt or Evan's silence, but I could control where my money went, where my respect was directed, how much of myself I allowed to be drained for someone else's comfort. That night, I chose dignity over bitterness. I chose action over silence. The first attempt to save my son had failed at his doorstep. My new attempt would be different, not about saving him, but about saving myself. If you're still with me and felt the weight of failure sink in, type number 4 below so I know you're locked in. Now, let's step into Chapter 5, where conflict finally erupts. The morning after Christmas Eve broke clear and bright, sunlight pouring across South Lamar, as if the city were trying to convince me nothing was wrong. I rose earlier than usual, the habit of years in emergency services still wired into my body. For the first time in years, though, I felt light. There would be no automatic withdrawal gnawing at my account this month, no hidden lifeline draining my retirement. I ground beans, brewed a pot of coffee, and inhaled the aroma as if it were freedom itself. Each sip tasted stronger because it was mine, bought with my own earnings, untouched by anyone else's needs. The peace didn't last long. My phone buzzed on the counter, once, twice, then continuously, until the vibration rattled the mug beside it. At first, I ignored it, letting the messages pile up. But curiosity made me glance at the screen. Evan's name filled the log, his texts streaming in desperate bursts. "Dad," the card declined. "They froze the account. What happened?" "The supplier is threatening to repossess the mixer unless I pay a deposit today. Please, I need you. Just this once." The panic leapt off the screen, but instead of jolting me into action, it steadied me. For the first time, he was facing what I had always faced alone: responsibility. I poured another cup of coffee and sat down at the table, letting the phone buzz itself into exhaustion. Eventually, I answered. His voice was strained, the background noise chaotic. Raised voices, doors slamming. "Dad, please." The lines shut down, the supplier is demanding cash, and Madison's parents are here saying we embarrassed them. "I just need you to cover this one thing." I let the silence hang before I replied. "No. From now on, it's yours to manage." He tried again, the desperation cracking his words. "Please, I'm begging you." But I repeated myself, gently but firmly. "No, son. It's your turn." I hung up and sat back, the quiet in my kitchen sounding almost holy after his frantic voice. Later, curiosity pulled me into my truck. I drove past the studio, slowing as I approached. Through the front windows, I saw chaos stripped of glamour. The guests from last night's mixer were gone, but the mess remained. Empty glasses scattered across tables, decorations half torn down. Madison stood in the center, arguing heatedly with her parents. Pamela's arms were crossed, her lips tight with disdain. Grant's face was red, his finger stabbing the air as he lectured about humiliation and ruined reputations. I parked and walked inside. The room went still for a moment. Madison's eyes narrowed. Evan looked both relieved and ashamed. Grant turned toward me, his expression sharpened into contempt. "So you're the reason we're standing in this disaster. You cut the cord and left them to drown." I kept my voice level. "I stopped playing the fool. That's different." Evan stepped forward, pleading. "Dad, please, just once more. Help me patch this. I'll make it right after I looked at my son, really looked at him." The lines of worry that made him seem older than his 33 years. The desperation that came when the scaffolding was gone. "You called me useless last night," I said softly, "but it seems I'm the only one who can hold this place together." Which is it, Evan? Am I useless, or am I the foundation? His mouth opened, but no words came. Madison filled the silence, her tone cutting. He's manipulating you. He just wants control. I turned to her. Control comes with responsibility. I carried it for years. Now, it's his turn. From my coat pocket, I pulled out a folder I had brought deliberately. Inside were the documents showing the lease terms, the line of credit, the warranties, every paper tying me to this place. I set it on the table between us. Here are your choices. 1. You restructure this lease under strict terms, make payments on time, accept mandatory oversight from my accountant. 2. You walk away, and everything, equipment, space, reputation, slips through your fingers. Grant sneered. You think you can strong-arm us? I have lawyers who— Good, I interrupted. Bring them. Every signature is mine. Every loan, every guarantee, mine. The law will only confirm it. Silence followed, thick as the December air. Evan's hands trembled as he reached for the pen I had set down. Madison hissed something under her breath, but he ignored her. Slowly, reluctantly, he signed. I gathered the papers back into the folder. Now it begins, I said. No more lifelines. You'll swim or sink on your own. The studio, which Madison had tried to turn into her glittering stage, had transformed into something else entirely. A courtroom, a reckoning. For the first time, I wasn't the man in the shadows. I was the one holding the gavel. The studio was silent after Evan's pen scraped across the paper. It wasn't the silence of peace, but the heavy pause that comes when a storm finally stops and everyone waits to see what's left standing. Madison sat stiffly in her sequined dress from the night before, her eyes sharp with fury. Grant paced in the corner, muttering about lawyers and reputations, while Pamela shook her head as if she'd wandered into a place far beneath her standards. Evan looked down at the table, shoulders slumped, the ink on the contract barely dry. Shame clung to him like sweat, but I could also see something else there, a flicker of relief. For the first time in years, the path in front of him was no longer blurred with borrowed money and endless excuses. It was harsh, but it was clear. I closed the folder and rested my hand on top of it. The terms are simple, I said evenly. Payments come on time, no delays. You'll meet with my accountant every week. You'll learn how to run numbers, not just chase dreams. And there will be no more debts in the shadows. If I hear about another gambling slip, the lease ends immediately. Evan lifted his head, his face pale. Gambling. His voice cracked like a boy's, not a man's. Madison flinched, her mouth tightening. I looked directly at her. Yes, she already told me, the color drained from Evan's face as he turned to her. You told him? Her silence was an answer in itself. She looked away, focusing on a smudge on the wall, as if it were more important than the implosion happening in front of her. Grant saw an opening and pounced. You see, he barked. This is humiliation. He's dragging private matters into the open. Evan, don't let him do this to you. You're an adult. You don't need your father dictating terms like some landlord. I met Grant's glare with calm steel. Dictating terms? Number. I'm setting boundaries, something that should have been done years ago. Evan's hands curled into fists on the table. His gaze darted between me, Madison, and Grant, the weight of all sides pressing down on him. I could almost hear the war in his head, loyalty to his wife and her parents, fear of losing the studio, anger at me for cornering him, and beneath it all, the quiet, undeniable truth that I was right. Son, I said softly, cutting through the noise, this isn't about pride or humiliation. It's about whether you want to grow up and stand on your own. I've carried you for years. It ends now. You have two choices. Take responsibility and build something real, or lose it all, the studio, the marriage, and the father who kept you afloat. The words landed heavy. Evan stared at the papers as if they were bricks stacked against his chest. For a long moment, no one spoke. Madison shifted in her chair, her eyes flickering with cold resentment. Grant shook his head in disgust. Pamela sighed dramatically, already composing a story she'd tell her friends about this disaster. Finally, Evan exhaled, the fight draining out of him. "I'll do it," he whispered. Then louder, with a hint of defiance meant more for them than for me. "I'll do it." The admission wasn't triumphant. It was reluctant, cracked around the edges. But it was the first time I had heard him choose responsibility instead of denial. Grant scoffed. "You'll regret letting him control you." Evan turned on him, surprising us both. "I've been letting everyone else control me for years. Creditors, suppliers, expectations. Maybe it's time I learned how to control myself." His voice shook, but his words held a truth even he couldn't deny. Madison's lips parted, ready to fire back. But Evan didn't give her the chance. He pushed the papers toward me. "Tell your accountant I'll be there." I nodded once, not gloating, not victorious, just steady. "Good. Then we start fresh." As I gathered the folder and prepared to leave, I glanced around the room that had tried to dress itself as glamorous, but now felt more like a courtroom stripped of illusions. The glittering decorations looked cheap in the daylight, the empty glasses like evidence of excess. Outside, the winter sun shone on the pavement, blindingly bright after the dim tension inside. I walked to my truck and leaned against the door for a moment, breathing in the crisp air. This wasn't victory. Evan was far from reformed, and the road ahead would be rough. But for the first time in years, the choice was his. And maybe, just maybe, that meant there was hope. If you're still watching and can feel the intensity of this choice, drop number 5 in the comments so I know you're right here with me. Now, let's move into Chapter 7, where the consequences unfold. The days after Christmas passed in a blur of silence from my son. At first, I half expected him to call every morning with some new excuse, some desperate plea. Instead, the silence stretched, filled only by secondhand whispers and the occasional sight of him across town. Word traveled quickly in Austin, especially after that disastrous mixer. Clients trickled away from the studio, some out of simple practicality, others because gossip carried louder than any advertisement. Evan tried to shoulder it alone. I heard from a former paramedic buddy who rented space in the same block that the lights at the studio burned past midnight. He'd walk by after grabbing tacos and see Evan hunched over the counter, receipts scattered like snow. Once he caught him alone on the floor, staring at an unplugged mixer as if it were mocking him. Pride had kept Evan from answering my calls in the past. Now it kept him from making them. Madison, on the other hand, made her bitterness known. She posted curated photos of herself at wine bars, but even her captions had a sharp edge. Some people drag you down when they should lift you up. Behind the gloss, her resentment boiled. She blamed me for pulling the rug out from under her, for exposing the fragile scaffolding of their life. She told her parents that I had humiliated them intentionally. Grant and Pamela, once fixtures at charity galas, began declining invitations. Their names circulated through whispers in country club corners. The Clarks, living off Alvarez money, not as polished as they seemed. Pride had been their currency. Now it was in short supply. At night, when the city quieted and cicadas replaced traffic noise, I sometimes thought about Evan sitting alone in that studio. I wondered if he was finally learning the value of responsibility or just resenting me more. His voice from that Christmas Eve, "You're the most useless man ever," still rang in my ears. But then I remembered his signature on those papers, the way his hands had trembled. He had chosen, however reluctantly, to step into adulthood. That choice carried weight. Meanwhile, my own life began to breathe again. With no monthly transfer draining my account, I fixed the porch light that had flickered for months. I replaced the leaky faucet with a new one that gleamed under the kitchen bulb. I stocked my fridge with groceries that didn't come from the discount aisle, fresh produce, a decent cut of beef, even a bottle of wine Elena once favored. Neighbors noticed. Mrs. Kim across the street waved more often, commenting that I looked lighter these days. I even found myself humming while repairing a broken chair in the yard, a small joy I hadn't felt in years. Yet relief didn't erase sadness. I sat on the porch some evenings with a glass of iced tea, watching the headlights crawl along Lamar, and thought of the boy who used to sit beside me, asking endless questions about the stars. That boy had grown into a man lost in debts and borrowed dreams. I wanted to believe the flicker of responsibility I saw in him would grow into something steadier, but trust doesn't rebuild overnight. One evening, as December gave way to January, my phone buzzed with a voicemail. The screen showed Evan's name. I let it ring out, heart beating hard, then pressed play. His voice was raw, thinner than I remembered. "Dad, I don't know if I can do this. The bills, the pressure, it's more than I thought. I thought I was ready, but maybe I'm not." The message ended abruptly, leaving a hollow quiet. I sat at the kitchen table, listening again. Every instinct from my years as a paramedic screamed to rush in, to fix, to carry the weight for him. But I knew if I did, nothing would change. This was his trial, not mine. So I placed the phone face down and let the silence hold. Out the window, Christmas lights still clung stubbornly to a neighbor's fence, their colors dim but steady against the night. I thought about choices, the ones I had made, the ones Evan now faced. For the first time in decades, the outcome wasn't in my hands. And though that hurt, it was also the truest gift I could give him, the chance to stand or fall on his own. The first weeks of January settled over Austin with gray skies and a damp chill that seeped into the bones. I kept myself busy. I replaced the cracked concrete step on the porch, patched a section of roof that had leaked for too long, and even bought new curtains for the living room. Each small repair felt like reclaiming a piece of the life I had nearly given away. Money stayed in my account, not vanishing on the 15th of every month. For the first time in years, I lived without the constant hum of anxiety. On Sundays, I drove over to my sister Rosa's house. Her kitchen was always full, children running around, the smell of arroz con pollo filling the air, voices overlapping in warm chaos. They set a plate for me without asking, poured me a glass of sweet tea, and made space at the table as if I had never left. Those dinners reminded me that family could still mean comfort, not just obligation. It was after one of those evenings, late on a Monday, that my phone buzzed with a message from Evan. 3 words. "Can we talk?" I stared at it for a long while. The old version of me would have answered immediately, rushing to soothe, to fix, but I wasn't that man anymore. I set the phone down and went to bed, letting the message sit unanswered. The next day, after brewing coffee and reading the paper, I typed back, "Tomorrow, my place." When the knock came, I already knew it was him. Evan stood on the porch, shoulders slumped, shirt wrinkled as though he had slept in it. His eyes carried heavy circles, and he looked older than his 33 years. He didn't step inside right away, waiting for me to gesture. "Come in," I said, keeping my voice steady. He sat on the couch, hands clasped, staring at the floor. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, he broke the silence. "I can't do this alone." I thought I could, but I was wrong. His voice cracked, but this time there was no demand in it, no expectation. "I don't want money. I need to learn. Teach me what I don't know." The words settled between us like fragile glass. I leaned back in my chair, studying him. Part of me felt relief. At last, he was humbling himself. But another part carried sorrow. It had taken humiliation, loss, and desperation to bring him here. "You want guidance?" I said slowly, "not a bailout." He nodded quickly, as if afraid I might misunderstand. "I'll figure out the money. Just show me how to manage, how to keep from falling deeper." I let the quiet stretch, making sure he felt the weight of what I was about to say. "I'll help. But listen carefully. The days of me covering your bills are over. I won't be your guarantor again. If you gamble or waste, you face the consequences. Respect is the price of my time, and if you can't give that, then we have nothing left to build on." Evan lifted his eyes at last. They were red, but clear. "I understand." For once I believed him. He wasn't magically transformed, but the arrogance had cracked, replaced by something raw, recognition. We talked for nearly an hour, not about the past, but about simple steps forward. I explained the basics of budgets, of separating personal from business accounts, of cutting expenses before chasing growth. He listened quietly, no interruptions, no excuses. That silence felt like the beginning of something new. When he finally stood to leave, the air between us was still heavy, but no longer hostile. He paused at the door. "Thank you," he said softly, almost like a boy again. I walked him out to the porch. The evening was cool, the street quiet except for a neighbor's dog barking in the distance. He got into his car and drove off, leaving me alone with the soft glow of the repaired porch light. I sat back in my chair, sipping the last of my coffee, and let myself breathe. The bond between us was still fragile, like a cracked vessel held together by careful hands. But for the first time, there was a chance to mend it, not through money, not through sacrifice, but through boundaries and respect. As the night deepened, I felt a faint sense of hope. The wounds were far from healed, but the first step had been taken. And sometimes, one honest step is enough to change the path ahead. If you're still here and sense the fragile hope beginning to return, leave a number 6 below so I know you're still walking this path with me. Now, let's turn to Chapter 9, where the ending comes into view. By the time spring settled over Austin, the city had shaken off the gray of winter. Trees along South Congress bloomed with pink buds. The air carried the smell of barbecue smoke, and afternoons stretched warm and golden. My house, once worn and tired, stood straighter. The porch had fresh paint, the roof no longer leaked, and my small yard sprouted the beginnings of a vegetable garden. The food truck I co-owned with my friend picked up steady business as festivals returned, and my evenings were filled with dinners at Rose's house. For the first time in years, my life felt like mine again. But while my days grew lighter, Evan's darkened. The whispers reached me first: missed payments, clients walking away, equipment repossessed one piece at a time. Then came the inevitable: foreclosure papers posted on the studio door. He had fought, I'll give him that, but the weight of debts, the lack of discipline, and the absence of Madison's support proved too much. Madison didn't stay for the fall. She packed her things in the middle of March, blaming me for everything. "Your father poisoned this," she hissed, according to one of Evan's neighbors who overheard the fight. Then she was gone, back under the wing of her parents, leaving Evan with the wreckage. I didn't hear from him until late one Thursday evening. A knock sounded at my door, hesitant, tired. I opened it to find Evan standing there, thinner than I remembered, his once proud posture bent. His clothes were rumpled, his face shadowed with sleepless nights. He looked less like a man in his 30s and more like the boy who used to ask me to fix his bike chain. "Dad," he said quietly, "I need to talk." I let him in, and he sank onto the couch, elbows on his knees. For a long while, he said nothing, just stared at the floor. Finally, he spoke. "It's gone. The studio, Madison, everything. I thought I could build something, but I didn't know what I was doing, and His voice broke, and he swallowed hard. "I was cruel to you. On Christmas. I called you useless when you were the only one holding me up. I'm sorry." The words were rough, but they were real. I sat across from him, hands folded in my lap, letting him speak. "I kept thinking about all those years you paid bills, covered debts, fixed what I broke. I told myself it was normal, that you owed it to me somehow, but it wasn't. You chose to carry me, and I treated you like a burden instead of a father." His eyes lifted, shining with tears he didn't try to hide. "I don't expect you to forgive me right away. I don't want to lose you completely." Hearing him stripped of arrogance, speaking without Madison's shadow behind him, was almost harder than hearing his insults months ago. I took a slow breath before answering. "Evan," I said, "forgiveness isn't the hard part. I forgave you long before tonight. The hard part is trust. That has to be rebuilt brick by brick, and it doesn't come through money anymore. I won't save you with checks or loans, but if you want to rebuild this, father and son, we start with respect." He nodded quickly, relief flooding his tired face. "I can do that. I'll try, at least." I stood and walked to the porch, gesturing for him to follow. The evening light stretched long shadows across the yard. cicadas already tuning their summer songs. We sat side by side in the old wooden chairs, the same ones that had carried me through years of waiting and disappointment. Now they carried something different, possibility. Neither of us spoke for a while. The sun dipped lower, painting the sky in streaks of orange and violet. Evan leaned back, exhaling deeply, as if for the first time he could breathe without the weight of pretense. The studio was gone, Madison was gone, but my son remained, finally stripped of illusions and defenses, present in the quiet where healing might begin. I looked at him and thought of Elena, of the lessons she would have wanted passed down. Sometimes a man has to lose everything he clings to before he can find what matters. Sometimes a fall is the only way to teach him how to stand. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in years, I felt we were standing on the same ground, and that was enough. The porch had become my sanctuary again. Weeks after Evan's return, I sat there most evenings with a cup of coffee in hand, watching the world slow down under the wide Texas sky. The porch light I had fixed glowed steadily above me, no longer flickering. It was a small thing, but it symbolized more than just a working bulb. It was a reminder that I had reclaimed my dignity, that I no longer lived in the shadows of debts I didn't owe. I thought often about the journey that had brought me here. Only a few months earlier, my son had looked me in the eye and called me the most useless man ever. That wound had cut deep. Not because the words were true, but because they came from the boy I had carried on my shoulders during Christmas parades, the man whose dreams I had financed at the cost of my own comfort. But sitting in that chair now, I realized those words had been a turning point. They forced me to see the truth, that I had allowed myself to be used, that I had mistaken sacrifice for love. Money had been the stage on which our drama played out, but the heart of it was respect. Love without respect is nothing more than sentiment, fragile and fleeting. For years, I gave and gave, believing my silence was proof of devotion, but silence had only taught my son to take. The lesson I should have taught earlier, the one I finally delivered that Christmas Eve, was that boundaries are love too. Sometimes the hardest no is the most necessary gift. Being a father, I understood at last, was not about shielding children from every fall. It was about letting them stumble, sometimes even hit the ground, so they could learn to stand on their own. I had robbed Evan of that chance by cushioning every blow. The moment I stepped back, the moment I let him face the consequences, was the moment he finally started to grow. Painful as it was, that was fatherhood in its truest form. Evan visited now and then, not with demands, but with presence. Sometimes he'd help mend a fence post or rake leaves. Sometimes he'd just sit beside me, drinking coffee, both of us watching the sun slip low. Our conversations were cautious, tentative, but they carried a weight of honesty that had been missing for years. He no longer asked for checks. Instead, he asked questions about budgets, about discipline, about the years I had worked through exhaustion as a paramedic. In those quiet talks, I saw the beginnings of a man finally taking shape. I knew our bond was still fragile. Trust takes time to rebuild, and scars don't fade overnight. But the difference was clear. We were building on solid ground now, not quicksand. Each small step mattered. Each respectful word, each shared silence was a brick in a new foundation. One evening, after Evan left, I sat back and let the warm spring air wash over me. I thought about Elena, about the lessons she would have wanted me to pass down. She had always believed dignity was worth more than comfort, that living true to yourself was the only way to honor the family name. I wish she could have seen this moment, the beginning of healing between father and son, built not on dependency but on mutual respect. As the porch light hummed softly, I realized the truth I wanted to carry forward. Respect begins at home. It begins with how we allow ourselves to be treated, with the boundaries we draw and the dignity we protect. I had lost years to silence and sacrifice, but I had found myself again by standing firm. The greatest revenge I understood now isn't anger or payback. It's living free, with head held high, letting those who doubted you see your strength. It's refusing to be defined by someone else's scorn, and instead defining yourself through resilience. The sky darkened, stars pricking through the twilight. I finished my coffee and leaned back, content. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in years, I welcomed it. I wasn't the useless man my son had once named me. I was a father who had rediscovered his worth, a man who had chosen dignity over despair, and in that choice, I had given both of us a chance to begin again. There are moments in life when silence becomes heavier than words, when the absence of respect wounds more deeply than any spoken insult. Those moments reveal a truth we often ignore. The worth of a person is never measured by the approval of others, but by the dignity they claim for themselves. It is easy to confuse sacrifice with love, to believe that giving endlessly will guarantee loyalty or gratitude. Yet, time shows that when giving has no boundaries, it becomes less a gift and more a chain, binding both the giver and the receiver in a cycle of dependency and resentment. To live fully is to understand the quiet strength of boundaries. Boundaries are not walls that shut people out. They are doors that teach others how to enter. They are reminders that respect is not optional, that love without respect is hollow. When someone begins to recognize the value of their own dignity, the world around them shifts. What once felt like loss becomes liberation. What once looked like rejection becomes the seed of freedom. Life, after all, is not defined by the possessions we accumulate or the roles others assign to us. It is defined by the courage to stand up, even when standing up means standing alone. True worth does not come from titles, wealth, or approval. It comes from resilience, from the ability to say enough when exploitation masquerades as loyalty. It comes from the steady knowledge that strength is not found in domination, but in refusing to surrender to indignity. Every family, every relationship will eventually face its reckoning. It may come quietly, in an offhand remark that stings, or violently, in a betrayal that cannot be ignored. When that reckoning arrives, one is faced with a choice: continue the pattern of silence and sacrifice, or step into the difficult but necessary act of change. Choosing change is never easy. It costs comfort, it invites conflict, and it often leaves scars. Yet in those scars lies the blueprint for a new beginning. There is a paradox at the heart of love. To truly care for others, one must also care for oneself. A life spent only giving, without receiving respect in return, corrodes the soul. But a life lived with clear boundaries teaches a deeper kind of compassion, the compassion that says, "I will walk beside you, but I will not carry you forever." That kind of love empowers rather than enslaves. It is love that calls people to rise to their own potential, even if they stumble along the way. Failure, too, has its place. Sometimes people must fall before they can understand the ground beneath their feet. Failure strips away illusions, showing us who we are without the costumes of pride or pretense. And in that raw exposure, growth becomes possible. To allow another person to face the weight of their own choices is not cruelty. It is respect for their ability to learn. It is faith that they can build strength not from our constant rescue, but from their own resilience. In the end, the most powerful revenge is not revenge at all. It is the decision to live freely, to walk forward without bitterness, to let dignity shine where once there was despair. It is to become living proof that strength cannot be stolen by betrayal, that respect cannot be erased by insult. It is to embody the truth that freedom begins not when others recognize our value, but when we recognize it ourselves. And so the lesson stands. Life will test us through betrayal, disappointment, and the sting of disrespect. But those trials are not the end of our story. They are the fire that shapes us, the pressure that reveals our true form. When we choose to rise from them with our heads unbowed, when we choose to protect our dignity as fiercely as we once protected others, we discover the quiet triumph of a life reclaimed. That triumph is not loud or boastful. It is steady, enduring, and deeply human. These turning points remind us that setting boundaries and valuing ourselves is not just an act of courage. It's the foundation of living with dignity. Now, I'd love to hear from you. What's one lesson from this story that you feel connected to, and how will you apply it in your own life? Let's grow together by sharing our thoughts. If this story resonated with you, drop a 1 in the comments. If not, feel free to leave a 0. Your feedback helps us improve. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that touch the heart and spark reflection. Thank you for watching, and here's to living life with strength, honesty, and authenticity.